Hello and good evening, everyone. It is your girl, Marcie Thomas, the founder of Brown Girl Collective and Live Well Sister. So I just want to welcome you this evening for what's going to be a wonderful conversation. As you can see, we talk about a lot of different topics in this space, and tonight we're going to be talking about relationships, specifically Black love relationships. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation because the book that we'll be discussing is one that I've had for a while, and I really wanted to get into this conversation because I think it's an important one for us to have. So as you're coming into the room, you can drop us a note in the comment just to let us know that you're here, where you're joining us from. I am coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta. My guest this evening is also in the area, so it's going to be a really good conversation. So tonight we're going to be discussing the book Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African American Marriage. And just to let you know, it's going to get deep because there's some deep stuff in here, but it's just, as I said earlier, a very important conversation. So Dr. Dianne Stewart is a professor of religion and African American studies at Emory University, where she created and taught several courses: Black Love, The Power of Black Self-Love, and Black Women, Black Love, and the Pursuit of Happiness. She earned her Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and her Ph.D. in Systematic Theology from Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, raised in Hartford, Connecticut, and currently lives in Atlanta, as I've already mentioned. So without any further delay, welcome to the room, Dr. Stewart. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for hosting me today, Marcie. I appreciate it.
Oh yes, as I said, I've had your book for a while. It's been out for a couple of years now.
That's right. At the height of the pandemic. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but it's such an important topic that I'm glad that we are able to dive into it. And actually, there's been some things that happened recently in the news that has brought some of the things you talk about back up. You know, I'm thinking of Ebony Williams and some of the kickback towards her about some of her desires as a Black woman seeking Black love. So what is it that inspired you to go into this space of just talking to us and teaching us about Black love?
Yeah, so many years ago, I started a course called Black Love. Just, you talked about the 3 courses. It began with just the Black Love course. And that course is quite general. We deal with love in so many different contexts: love in politics, love in the family, love in masculinity, Black feminism and womanism in Black love, love in popular culture. So I had a little unit. I was very, very reluctant to do this, but I had a little unit on love and romance. And so I was looking at love, romance, coupling, marriage among heterosexual Black couples. And I started to do my research for that section. And I was just floored by what I saw in the sociological literature. I just couldn't believe how dire the situation was when it came on to marriage and Black life. I had been having conversations about coupling and dating with Black women and how difficult it is to find healthy love for years upon years, right? Since my college days, but I didn't really realize what the numbers look like. And so, a lot of time had passed and I hadn't even taught the class for a while. I retaught it again in 2016, and
Mhm.
now it's more like a staple. At that time, I said, let me look again at what new material might be out on love and romance. And I just became more and more impassioned about making sure that what I was learning could be available to the public. And so, what I mean by that is the social scientists have done great work, but it's
Right.
always academic facing. It's very complicated work. It's for insiders. Some historians have begun to write about marriage and slavery, and even post slavery. And that's been very interesting work as well. But I knew of nobody that that was able to talk about the arc of Black
Mhm.
love, coupling, and marriage from the slave ship to social media. And that's what I wanted to do. So it's broad strokes, but I wanted to make this argument that wasn't being made in public conversations.
Right.
Most public conversations seem to blame Black women who desire love, coupling, and/or marriage, and basically took a self-help approach. These are the things you need to do to fix yourself, or to make yourself more competitive on the very, tight marriage market. And
Mhm.
so I felt that there was a new conversation to be had about the structural and systemic foundations of this problem, what I call forbidden Black love. And so that's why I wrote it. And I ultimately argue that this problem of forbidden Black love is a civil rights problem. It is America's unrecognized civil rights problem. And I didn't know anyone who was arguing that and making that point. So that's why I decided to break from my normal research trajectory
Right.
and write the book.
Right. And it is definitely, the book is definitely well researched. You have several pages at the end of just, being able to give us those resources and things that you did so that people can see that there was really in-depth study that went into this process. And what I do love about the book is the fact that it isn't telling us as Black women, me as a Black woman. I told you I'm one of those Black women who's never been married in my, well, actually now I'm in the second half of my 50s, never been married. And so the people always look at you and say, what's wrong with you? Or what are you not doing? Or, it's because you're too intelligent, or you're too, whatever it is that they tell us that we're too much of, we're too much. And that's the reason why. But just to understand that there are a lot of other factors that play into whether or not we're able to find Black romantic love.
And actually, Marcie, your exact situation is a really important case to think about, because there is a statistic out there, and most people say they find more comfort in saying, well, Black women, basically postmenopausal Black women over 50, or in their 50s and above, most are married. And that's not exactly the statistic.
Mhm.
What it is that most Black women over the age of 54 will have been married at least once. It's not saying that they're necessarily married at the time, but they
Right.
will have been married at least once. And here you are saying, well, I'm over 54 and I haven't been.
Right, right. So yeah, and obviously there's nothing wrong with me. I mean, look at me. I'm just kidding.
No,
There's nothing wrong. It's not about me.
that's
There are
exactly right.
whole lot of factors, that play into that. But I really want to get into the things that you talk about in the book, because it is, as I said, it's taken from a societal level. It's not pointing fingers at individuals and individual behaviors, but looking at it from a societal behavior. So, as you already stated, it started on the slave ship.
That's exactly right. Most Black women, most African women, I should say, the average age was 15, and most of them would have been mothers on those slave ships. And they were not traveling with their children and their spouses. It just wasn't happening. So we're looking at separation already happening on the continent of Africa. So we're already looking at the disruption of marriages, of families, of communities. And of course, that continues right into slavery. Many African descendants married during slavery, but those marriages were not legal, they were not protected, and there was a lot of disruption, especially with the rise of the domestic slave trade. So, separation of couples and families is one of those four pillars of what I call forbidden Black love, and so I do try to tell stories about
Mhm.
how that unfolded during slavery, so that people can experience it through the narratives of people who were children of enslaved people or formerly enslaved themselves.
And you do a good job of that. One person that you mentioned is Margaret Garner, and some of us may be familiar with the story, even if we're not familiar with the actual person, because the film Beloved kind of.
That's right. That's exactly right. Margaret Garner, I thought it was important to begin with her because I also wanted to address the tragedy of the lack of agency, the lack of choice that Black women, Black mothers found themselves wrestling with, as they thought about a life of freedom for themselves and tried to plot a path toward that. Margaret Garner, she and her husband, her mother and father-in-law, other enslaved African descendants, flee Kentucky and cross the Ohio River in the 1850s, seeking fugitive freedom, which was always an extremely dangerous thing.
Mhm.
Fugitivity um, it was precarious. There was no stability in relaxing into a life of freedom because um, legal owners of enslaved people who were fugitives could always find ways to try to recapture their so-called property. And
Mhm.
that's what happened in Margaret's case. But what she does is she actually kills her 2-year-old daughter, attempts to kill her adolescent sons and children, and then also her baby girl. And she had decided that killing them would be better than being recaptured into slavery. And tough it's a very tough story to hear.
Yes.
But I need audiences. I say to my audiences, we have to read about it. They had to live it.
Mhm.
And and I want us to understand that marriage for African descendants and slaveholding were contradictory. It was a paradox. One could not perform the rights and responsibilities associated with marriage, with the commitment to marriage, and also be enslaved to someone who had more sovereignty over both people in the couple, um, and be married in a way that felt normal, healthy, and free. They just contradicted one another, and I wanted audiences to understand that, and so that's why I begin with Margaret's story.
Yes, it's such a powerful story. And as you said, it's a sad story. It's a hard story, but it's true. And, just that, her story, the fact that her and other women went through a thing of course, their bodies were not their own. Their bodies weren't their husbands. Their bodies belonged to the person who owned them. And just the fact that, they could be forced to have children with their slave holders. They could be forced to have children with other men, all sorts of things. And to think that, from the perspective of that Black man who loves his family and wants to protect his family, he has no power whatsoever.
Indeed. If you remember at the end of that story, when Margaret's mother in law was interviewed by the Reverend Bassett, she tells him that her own husband, had been separated from her for 20 years because that happened as well. Slaveholders would often hire out their enslaved property. And she said, I would have preferred that he not even return to have to
Mm.
witness the abuses I suffered and for me to have to witness the abuses he suffered. It's just that is a terrible thing to hear. Again, she's married, she's had children with her husband. He now is sent someplace else to work, and she's saying, I would prefer not to be reunited with my husband under the structure of slavery. That's a
Mm.
major commentary.
That is just to think that it wasn't what it should have been.
That's right.
One of the things in this particular chapter is titled "Jumping the Broom," and you reveal something I never knew about the whole concept of jumping the broom. Tell us a little bit about that and what you share in the book. And this isn't giving too much away. This is just snippets, just so you
Oh
know.
no,
I
sure.
want you to read. I want y'all who are watching. I want you to read the book. But I just found this very, very
Sure.
interesting. The whole concept of jumping the broom.
Yes, and let me just share with your audiences, I did write I pulled out that material and expanded it a little bit into an article that was published in Oprah Daily, and folks can find that on my website, which is, it gives more context for my own search to understand jumping the broom. But one of the things that a lot of African Americans are not aware of is that jumping the broom is a folk pre-Christian European custom. It was practiced in Wales. It was practiced by the Welsh, by people commonly known as gypsies, but who are the Roma people. It was practiced also by Jews in Europe. I can tell you a little bit more about that. Um, and it was brought over. Many of the Welsh came and settled in the South, brought over with them. So it is, from what we know, it is not an African tradition. It is a European tradition, and enslaved persons were either made to jump the broom, or might have chosen it because it became such a part of the culture, might
Right.
have chosen to do it themselves. The other thing to note is that there are also a number of ceremonies that enslaved or formerly enslaved persons talk about that don't mention jumping the broom as well.
Mhm.
So that's just interesting. We don't know enough about their marriage customs and betrothal kind of practices or rituals. But I know with the production of Roots, and there was a really powerful
Right.
scene of jumping the broom, I think many African Americans became very connected to that ritual. And what I say in the book is, some people will be very uncomfortable with finding out that it's not so much African American. It's not African. It's not so much even African American. But some people might feel like it doesn't matter. I still want to jump it in honor of the fact that they had to jump it, or
Mhm.
that was what was available. So it's not an indictment
Oh,
on what anyone has done or what anyone has has uh, thought about the custom, but the more information we have, the better. I first began to research it as an undergrad when I was studying abroad in Nigeria, and I talk about it in that article. And then when I got married for the first time, I researched it. There was a book that had come out called Jumping the Broom. I think it was one of the editors at Essence who
it
wrote it.
was. It was. It
Yes,
was a book about black,
yes.
basically like a wedding planning book.
That's
Yes.
right. And I had just finished my master's program at Harvard when I got married, and I just was never convinced. I felt like this is not an African custom. It's just not. I was never convinced that it was, and then I finally found out that it's a deep European custom. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not African from anything we can tell.
Right, right. Well, thank you for sharing that because and when I read that, I was like, wow, okay, okay. But there are a lot of things that we have fallen into as Africans in America, African Americans that weren't necessarily a part of our culture anyway. Because in some ways, some of the tenets of marriage in and of itself is based on patriarchy, white supremacy, things like that.
Absolutely. I think this is the one area or theme in the book that is hardest to engage a number of Black folks on, because we are so wedded to and oftentimes fascinated with the idealization of patriarchal marriage and family formation. And that idealization was a direct program that the Freedmen's Bureau, white missionary societies, and at times Black missionary societies as well, because many of the free Blacks had been socialized into those customs, those ways of being married, instilled in freed women and men. So African descendants had their own um, courtship and marriage rituals and terms. They used terms like abroad marriage when they were separated, trial marriage, because they knew that all kinds of disruptions, not of their own choosing, could happen, and they themselves might want to try marriage and see how that worked. They
Mhm.
often pledged to be faithful to one another until death, or master separated them. That
Mhm.
actually made its way into their marital vows. Isn't that something?
Mm.
It's incredible when you think about that, to say, I want to do this knowing that we could be separated, not based on our own choosing. And so one of the things that we have to remember is that in the Euro-Western Anglo-American approaches to marriage, there was this doctrine of what they call coverture, which really um, was based in patriarchy. Women who got married lost their last names. We don't see that happening in pre-colonial Africa. Um, they were themselves socialized into ideal womanhood, which meant the domestic sphere was their sphere. The public sphere was the sphere of the man. They lost control over inheritance and what it meant to say negotiate contracts. Their husbands now would be in charge of that. Now, some that would, women did push against that eventually, and it was kind of abandoned by the late 19th century. However, that's what enslaved and freely new emancipated African descendants were socialized into. And really, this government viewed marriage as a gateway to citizenship.
Mhm.
You see, it's for you to prove that you could be authentic citizens. Marriage was that gateway, and heterosexual, patriarchal, monogamous marriage. And what this meant, and what was that, and it was taught, for example, that it was biblically revealed, and
Mhm.
certain scriptures would be used and quoted. There were readers. I think I include. I don't think I have the image in the book because they wouldn't let me put images in, but there were readers that enslaved Africans received from missionary societies that socialized them into these heteropatriarchal norms. Um, and a lot of us don't understand that.
Mhm.
Uh, Africans on the continent had numerous ways of getting married, of sustaining marriage and family. There was no such concept of head of household that is just absolutely Euro-Western. I mean, in many cases, people lived in compound situations. There were always biological members of that family unit. There were many different people that could live in that compound, different domiciles. There is no household as one single unit with
Right.
a head. That is a very Euro-Western term. And many of us are convinced that this is the way God revealed the institution of marriage in the Bible, because that's what our ancestors were taught. Um,
Right.
by agents of this government and missionary societies and educators, volunteering in the South to socialize the new freely emancipated women and men. And one of the things I'm actually going to be writing a second a volume, because my readers are asking for more, and I think there's more to say. And one of the things I really want to work through is this issue. I want to take up. I mean, I am a scholar of religion. This is what I can
Right.
do. I want to take up this issue of the Bible revealing this kind of heteropatriarchal, monogamous marital institution. I think it is such a complicated issue, and most of us don't understand. So, for example, Black women who had never been under the authority, the absolute patriarchal authority of a husband, had to be. In
Mhm.
the South, where tenant farming was practiced, Black women could not get contracts
Right.
to work if they were not married, because it didn't fit into the heteropatriarchal vision of marriage. One's husband would have to control the wife's labor, right? Would
Mhm.
have to negotiate those contracts of the wife and any children. That was appropriate, proper Christian marriage. And so Black women are looking and saying, I haven't had to deal with this before. Many
Right.
of them married, and many of them left those husbands, especially if they were abusive to them, right?
Right.
Just to be able to work. So it was a very chaotic time and period. And I think it's really important for us to know that that patriarchy absolutely existed in Africa, but it
Mhm.
wasn't unchallenged. It wasn't absolute patriarchy. It wasn't it was complemented, or it was it competed with matricentric, matrifocal traditions. You never saw absolute patriarchy in that way.
Mhm.
um, and African women had freedom of movements. They often were very, um, um, in terms of the structure and administration of their local economies, they were often very profoundly involved as leaders of their local markets. It was just a very different situation than what the newly freed African Americans were being socialized into. And I want to say this, Marcie, and this is really important. One of the reasons it was critical for the federal government to instill this vision of marriage, this patriarchal, normative vision of marriage, was so that the federal government could absolve itself of the responsibility to care for indigent women, children, and
Mhm.
elders.
Mhm.
You, black man, it is your responsibility as the patriarch, although we will never truly allow you to be patriarch,
Right.
but
Now,
it's your responsibility to take care of them, right? It's your responsibility to provide for your families. It's not our responsibility, it's yours. So there's a very important economic motive, um, in pushing this idealized vision of patriarchal marriage and household, on the freed women and freed men.
yeah, that you just said a mouthful there. Just to think, oh, we're pushing this on you because you have to be responsible, but then we're not necessarily giving you the tools that you need to be responsible. So it's like six in one hand, half a dozen in the other. So yes, and somebody I have a comment that says yes, the federal government, aka rich white dudes, absolving themselves economically.
Yes.
Yes,
Do you
yes.
remember the story of Reverend Simmons, that I talk about from Mississippi? I mean,
Mm,
it's the other thing to think about too, and I try to allow this to come through in the chapters, is how vulnerable Black people and communities were after slavery. We have to remember that when Black people are governed under the laws of property as enslaved persons, there is a measure of protection that
right,
slaveholders want to extend, because you don't want to destroy your own property,
right,
right? I mean, of course, they destroyed Black bodies, souls, and psyches all the
right,
time, but they
right,
don't want to exactly kill their human property because they
right,
need that human property. But after slavery, lynching goes haywire. It's
right.
everywhere. Um, there were just entire Black communities that were just massacred. So, on top of the federal government taking this position, Black people were just vulnerable to the whims of white racist vigilantes everywhere. So with Reverend Simmons' case, here he is, a 66-year-old Reverend Baptist minister with a landholder because his father had bought land in the late 1800s and his neighbor wants it. And what does
Mhm.
the good Black male patriarch do? The gentle patriarch, he gets a lawyer to settle the land dispute with his neighbor because he wants to ensure that his family will inherit his immovable wealth.
Right.
And what happens? The neighbor and his buddies take Reverend Simmons and lynch him by gunshot. They
Mhm.
take him and his son into the woods. They lynch him by gunshot, and they tell his son, if anyone asks about this, you do not know anything about this. And what happens? They find out that they had even cut out Reverend Simmons' tongue as well, maybe to suggest, as I say in the book, that you better be dead
Keep your
silent
mouth shut. Don't say
about.
anything.
And he
And
said, you must clear your family off this land within 1 week. The family went to New Orleans and they did seek help through the NAACP. But it's these kinds of things, and this was in 1944, right? So it's just these vulnerable communities that are at are can be subject to any kind of violation during these times as well, in addition to having the burden and the responsibility of kind of picking yourself up with no bootstraps after
Right.
slavery and
Right.
creating, as Black folks say, making a way out of no way.
Right.
This is what
Mhm.
happened during that reign of terror, 1865 to 1965.
And, as I was saying to you before we came online, that, just thinking of my own family history, not so much the enslavement piece, because I don't know too much about that
Mhm.
part, but just the reign of terror part, thinking of having, my mother who was born and raised in Southern Georgia and has moved back there now. And,
Mhm.
just understanding the fact that, like, her father went to Detroit looking for work, thinking of my dad who grew up in Southern Ohio, near the West Virginia border, how my other grandfather went to Cleveland because there were more opportunities. But then
Yes.
in that, think of how that impacted the family. Because in some cases, the families were able to stay together and work it out. In other cases, it just, it demolished the family.
One of the things that didn't make it into the book, there are two things that didn't make it into the book that I wish I had time to include, or I could have found a way to include. I came across, and these are digitized, you can find them online at times. I came across letters from Black men. I didn't see any written by Black women at the time, often with misspellings, trying to phonetically sound words out. It was just so touching, just heart wrenching to see their handwriting, writing for jobs in the North, writing to different companies that they've learned about, asking if I can come first and then my wife can come. If you can help me get something for my wife. I mean, it was just they were just so powerful to hear the ways that Black men were trying to forge a life for themselves and their families. Sometimes they had children, sometimes it was just them and their wives, and trying to figure out how they could start something new for themselves, escape the terror of the South, and the poverty of the South, and start something new for themselves, but also bring their wives along. And I didn't get any of them in there, but those letters do exist.
Right. And, just to think about that. And as I said, my mom was born in 45, my dad was born in 42. So their parents would have been dealing with a lot of these things and their decision making, how they were going to take care of their families, how they were going to maintain their families. And in some cases, they weren't able to maintain the family with the, being separated and things like that.
That's right. Absolutely.
Right. So yeah, there's a good portion of the book where you talk about that. And then we get into love and welfare. And one of the things you feature in this particular part is the movie Claudine, which I told you was actually one of my favorite movies growing up. Has a wonderful soundtrack by Gladys Knight and the Pips,
Oh,
written by
yes.
Curtis Mayfield. So so those of you all who've never seen the movie or listen to that soundtrack, I would suggest, just to see what it's all about. But just talking about how, so we went from being enslaved and not having any rights. Sometimes marriages weren't even considered, real. Same really during the reign of terror, Jim Crow area. A lot of times those marriages weren't really recognized and things like that. And now we move into, okay, now we have these welfare systems where families are trying to get help for their families, but there are a lot of rules and regulations that go along with that.
And those rules emerge as soon as welfare darkens, the face of welfare darkens. Black women were excluded from welfare programs. These mothers' pension programs from the 1930s. But as soon as Black women begin, and other women of color begin to enter welfare programs, which they needed desperately. I mean, we know we're still dealing with today the fact that Black women are making so much less than her counterparts for performing the same job, whether it's Black men, white women. So they desperately needed that kind of support. I mean, who would need to make a case for that? And at the same time, it was such minimal support. And then we begin to see these regulations like a suitable home, substitute father, man in the house. And they policed and controlled Black sexuality, and in many cases prevented and disrupted Black marriage. It is, I mean, it's almost unbelievable to think about. In Louisiana, for example, Since the 1960s, countless Black women and children received welfare benefits. But after Louisiana adopted those policies, 6,000 families representing more than 22,000 children were purged off of welfare rolls. And
Hmm.
we know that Claudine shows the social workers that were often tasked with going and visiting families unaware, at times when they were not told that they would be coming, and literally searching for men's clothing, men's slippers, whatever it might be. They would turn over people's hampers. They would go into their washing machines and ovens. They would look for anything, any sign that a mother might have something new, or something that looked a little bit too expensive to be bought based on the kind of welfare support she was receiving. And they would either deduct the check or eventually purge the mothers and children from the welfare list itself. So it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And in some cases, families who were married were told, we can, and welfare worked in tandem with government housing policies as
Hmm.
well,
Government housing. Hmm.
programs, and they were told, you can get in to this new housing, subsidized housing community, but the husband, the father, will have to leave, cannot go in. That's what happens with a heteropatriarchal vision of marriage. This vision of marriage that the man must be the provider. If there's a provider, we, the federal government, are not going to be providing,
Hmm.
because the man is there to provide. We see right there, when we think about the fact that 10 generations of wealth was stolen from Black people during slavery, or more, at least 10. There is no acknowledgement of that and what that means,
Hmm.
right? It's, as men, as patriarchs, you should be responsible for your families, knowing that Black men in the labor market were often in unskilled jobs,
Right.
very low wage jobs, if they could even find jobs. We can even think of the impact of the war, Vietnam War, on Black men's lives. And so, knowing that, it doesn't matter if a Black man is in the home, he has to figure out how to be that
Yeah.
patriarch. Doesn't matter that 10 generations of wealth has been stolen from you. Doesn't matter that you're still dealing with discrimination and racism. You must figure that out. And therefore, we cannot be the patriarch for you as a married Black woman. It was just incredible. And the truth is, these policies still exist today, and practices,
Mhm.
maybe not under the same name, but they still exist today. I'm hearing that welfare offices will call women today, and I'm thinking about Black women in particular, and just try to find out if a man is in the house, try to,
Mm.
yeah, to detect if a man is in the house. It's still happening today. Women are forced to literally sue the fathers of their children in order to be able to even benefit from TANF, welfare um, uh, subsidies. They are forced to literally sue. So it brings a kind of division and contention. It poisons the relationship as well, even today. But it was incredible and absurd. And I really want us to think about the fact that not only was Black women's sexuality being controlled, Black men's sexuality was
Absolutely.
controlled by these policies as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's this book covers so much, and there's no way we could get into everything. I really do suggest that you read it just to get into the depths of everything, because you do a really good job, Dr. Stewart, of just touching on everything. We're just kind of hitting at a high level just to kind of let you know what it's all about. And now, in present day, we are dealing with the prison industrial complex.
Yes, absolutely. And that began to boom right around 1980. So, once again, one structure after another. Um, right around 1980, Reagan era, and we are still grappling with, and I believe we will see the effects of what Michelle Alexander called mass incarceration for decades upon decades to come. Even though incarceration rates have gone down for Black men in recent years, they're still massively high. Black men are still highly disproportionately represented in the prison system, and especially in relationship to Black women in the prison system. So it's a major trauma to Black families and Black communities, and especially in particular urban areas. I mean, there are places where 1 in every 4 Black men will be involved in the carceral state in some fashion by the age of 33. I mean,
Mm.
this is devastating. And to also learn that Black men under the Clinton era were denied avenues to enhance their education, to actually pursue education by being denied college education, by being denied Pell Grants. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So when we think about what the prison system does to inmates, it's such a violent and abusive and toxic system in and of itself that does not often lead to rehabilitation. I'm not saying it
Right.
can never happen, but does not often lead to rehabilitation. So that even when Black men are released and might still be involved with the carceral state, as you
Right.
know, being on parole or what have you, the chances for reuniting with family, for being able to live a stable life, are still very low, very, very dire. And many relationships break up as a result of incarceration. It's very difficult. What happens is it's almost like Black women and families are punished just as much
Right.
as the incarcerated husband or boyfriend or partner, because they have to absorb the cost of payphone, collect
Mhm.
calls. They have to absorb the cost of commissaries. They can't bring cooked food from home. They have to buy the expensive food. They will have to help them with toiletries and buy from these expensive commissaries. I mean, these mega capitalist exploitative companies have just racked up on poor and lower middle class Black women, because of the way the services are provided for inmates, and the fact that Black women are forced, or women generally, or persons generally who want to visit their families or connect with their families or support their loved ones, or connect with them or support them when they're incarcerated, the way they are forced to pay for their relationships. They're forced to
Mhm.
pay in so many ways to have a relationship. And so I try to show that by bringing in the stories of Black women who have negotiated such relationships. Black women who are telling their husbands, "Well, you're just going to have to write your daughter because
Mhm. You
we,
can't
I
get on the
can't
phone.
afford to
Right.
pay for these phone calls." And what we know is that when inmates lose contact with family, which they often do, especially because of those exorbitant costs, prisonization sets in, and that means that prisonization is a term that they use to describe when inmates begin to transfer or shift their cultural values and norms to the values of the carceral facility itself,
Mm.
and that's when they're even at more danger, when it comes to being able to have what they would consider to be a normal, stable, healthy life upon release.
Right, and there's just so much in that because I mean, there's the thing, yes, yes, incarceration is big business. It absolutely is. But just as you were talking, and I just know from people that I know personally, from reading your book, that it impacts in so many different ways. Because as that Black single woman, oftentimes, what we hear and what we know to be true is that there may not be as many men available for us to date because they are caught up in that carceral
Yeah.
state. So that's one thing. If they do get out, some of the difficulties that they may face in just being able to build a stable life, to have a family, because no, everybody isn't looking to do something bad to go back to jail. That's false. But
That's right.
sometimes the situations lend itself, that they end up in situations that maybe they shouldn't be in because they can't make it work. You
True.
know, for the, the fact, like there's something in the book you talk about, if they have to have an ankle bracelet or whatever, they have to pay for their own ankle bracelet. I mean, I'm like, this is crazy.
And we know that local police forces, they have made money off of just finding Black people, just finding any law that they can use, these traffic violations to just rack up and to build revenue. And thank God that those kind of practices are being exposed today. Just preying on vulnerable, poor Blacks. And there is a reason that Black people are poor in this country. And we also have to look at one of the things I do in chapter 5, as you know, is I try to find research with Black men. Like we're always talking about these ineligible Black men. Well, who either don't value marriage or not available for marriage, or well, what do Black men have to say about this, right? So I use the research of Armand Perry, Dr. Armand Perry. He's awesome. He has a great book called Black Love Matters, where he does not exactly what I do, but he focuses on Black men and the challenges that they face as young Black married men. One of his studies, which he did with Dr. Derek Brooms, showed, it was several hundred Black women and men, showed that really Black people are looking for their partners to help lift them into the middle class. Because we have very little wealth. We now know that the lifespan of a high school, someone with a white person with a high school diploma is actually longer than a Black person with a college degree. Like the lifespan. And we know that for every dollar a white family has, a Black family has a dime. We know that a single income household, white family makes more money than a 2-income Black household. So there are serious issues of wealthlessness, as I call it in the book, wealthlessness, which is structural and systemic, and issues regarding wealth building that Black people truly bring to their marriage situations. And it's not just Black women, it's also Black men. So, that Black man who's making $40,000 a year is looking for that Black woman making $60,000 a year. And she's looking for the Black man making $80,000, $90,000 a year. So we miss each other in that sense, right? And so you throw incarceration into it, and he's not going to be a very appealing man for a lot of Black women, right? If he can't hold down a stable job upon release. So it is, a lot of this does touch on the area of wealthlessness and wealth building as well, and how that impacts Black marriages.
It definitely has an impact, on, I call it dating, mating, relating, all of that. It has a big impact. But what you just said, now this isn't necessarily a person that's incarcerated, but it does make me think about a topic that's been in the news lately. Because actually, we've only got about 10 minutes left. Can you believe that? It's been a great conversation. It goes so fast. I told you that.
Yes, you did.
But in the news lately, there has been the whole thing with Ebony K. Williams, who is, a pundit on television. She's a lawyer. I guess she was in a conversation with Iyanla Vanzant, and Iyanla Vanzant was saying, well, would you date the bus driver? And Ebony was like, well, does he own the buses?
She said, if he owns the bus, that's right.
He owns the bus. And, she's been getting a lot of flack for that. And I've heard that there are other things that have been said afterward that may lend itself to some of that flack. But what you just said makes a valid point in conjunction with what she said. She's like, hey, I built to a certain space. I built to a certain level. So it's not that I don't think this is just me talking. Not that, that person who drives a bus or whatever, these other, blue collar or whatever other jobs may have, that they're not a good person, but I have built to a certain place. So I'm looking for someone that I feel like is on par with what I've built to.
Well, I have not followed the fallout from it. I saw the clip myself. I have not followed the fallout. Is she getting fallout in the sense that she's being elitist and classist? Yeah. Okay, this is really interesting. So You know, as you know, my book doesn't really deal with that so much, right? I'm not really interested in policing people's relationships as it relates to interracial dating, although I raise issues about that in colorism. As you know, that's one of the major issues we have to deal with. Or as it relates to class issues or what have you, there are a lot of factors that go into what makes love and togetherness work for every individual couple. As much as I will talk about the issue of wealthlessness, and as much as I will talk about, I will push back against some of these capitalist, neoliberal approaches to marriage and coupledom that truly, truly worry me. I'm going to talk about that in the next volume because it is really problematic. These issues of high value men and
Oh my
what
God.
is that? My father probably never made anything more than $50,000 by the time he retired. And my father's not a high value man, a man who never lied to me, a man whom I always knew where he was, and a man who showed up for me every day of my life. He's not a high value man. Give me a break. So, as much as I will make those arguments, because we have to be clear, money does matter. We are in a capitalist society. I'm not going to say that money does not matter. It matters, but it's not the only thing. And
Mhm.
money cannot hold a family together. It cannot sustain love. It doesn't take the place of love. It can enhance the experience of a family and the well being and the quality of life. There's no doubt about it. But we have to pay attention to other deep, substantive factors that make for great coupling and successful, loving relationships, not just money.
Right.
But at the same time, I am not going to tell Ebony whom she should be looking
Right.
for. There are so many reasons that if that is the standard that she has established for herself, who am I to tell her that she should not have that standard? I would expect that that's not the only standard that she has, right? We we have to know that the principles and the values that the people that we're going to share the rest of our lives with, the person who's going to care for you when you can't wash yourself, you
Come on
can't
now.
feed yourself, that you align with that person. And this is why I kind of borrow from Bell Hooks, and I love her definition of love. And one of the things I point out in chapter 5 is that any kind of loving relationship requires the exact same qualities to actually sustain that love. The
Mhm.
qualities I express to a child, to my child, or to my siblings, or to my parents are exactly the qualities that my romantic love relationship also
Mhm.
needs. They are no different. And I understand love as a profound bond forged and expressed through attentiveness, care, respect, knowledge, a very important one, trust and commitment. And I say knowledge because you cannot truly love something or someone that you don't know.
Come on.
You might have an infatuation, you might have exciting feelings going on, and we often call that love. If that's going to be love, I'm going to call it baby love. Because the deep substantive love is I know the nasty parts of this person. I know the parts that just get under my skin, but I still love them. I
Mhm.
still have that ultimate deep, powerful connection to them, that sense of trust and care and mutual respect. I still love them even after knowing all these things about them.
Mm.
So for me, I need the conversation to move in that direction,
Right.
not just about money, but about these other aspects that
Mm.
allow love to remain healthy and to grow even through trauma
Mm.
and misfortune. Do you know what I mean, Marcy?
Absolutely.
That's exactly where I want it. And I don't think that she should be getting that flack, quite frankly. I really don't. Because there are also some real issues that people have to deal with when it comes on to class differences. people talk about being evenly yoked as it relates to spirituality, but there are other aspects that people that evenly being evenly yoked can really help in a marriage. So I don't want to judge any choice that anybody makes, whether it's crossing class lines or deciding not to. I think that that is a personal choice that comes with a number of other factors, when people are deciding on choosing partners and getting married.
And I love the fact that you brought up the whole thing of equally yoked. Now we might go a couple minutes after, just so
Okay,
you know,
I'm fine. I'm
because
fine.
it's 8:56. But
Okay.
the whole thing of being equally yoked, because as I mentioned earlier on, and you were talking to me about my situation. That is why a large factor in why I have not been married, because it is a thing of being equally yoked.
Yeah.
I have met people at church, and a lot of different spaces in my life. And when it comes down to are they really equally yoked with me, the answer has been no. So it is important. And it's not just about, spirituality, or, do we both have degrees? Do we both, live in whatever type of neighborhood? But it's a lot of other things that, personally, I think of if I'm in, just the fact that you and I are having this conversation, for example, can I have a similar conversation with my mate? Or if I bring something up like this, he's going to be like, what? Or, just I think about things like that. Is he a good person? Is he okay with me being the person that I am? Is he somebody who's trying to do this whole patriarchy thing? And I'm more like, can we be on an equal level? Can we both bring something to the table? Can we build? I'm thinking more like that. So a lot of that plays a factor in, for me personally, why I have not found that person yet.
And I think that is so important, and it's important to share that, because I do feel that a lot of people do decide to either compromise or I'm talking about the essential values, right? I'm not talking
Mhm.
about, the things that are negotiable, right? But the essential values. And I would not say that it's worth it. I respect the choice that you have made. I haven't found that person, and I respect that. The other thing that I don't talk about as much, in the book, that I think is good for us to remember and to share, is that I'm sure that you have a very fulfilled life as well. Like, perhaps being partnered or being married would enhance that, but I'm sure that you're enhancing your life in all kinds of ways. And I think it's important for us to remember that as well. That's one of the reasons I also argue for rethinking, our marriage and family structures, and particularly our family structures, which were demonized, especially by the Moynihan Report in 1965, as matriarchal, once again, deviating from the heteropatriarchal norm, and therefore toxic and pathological. And I think that, especially in our poor Black communities, there are many more flexible family forms where everyone has a role. The single auntie who didn't have any children, the older grand uncle who's basically like your granddaddy who did pass away already, the grandmother. Everyone has a role and plays a role, and can contribute and feel fulfilled by those roles. But I think if we're trying to um, adopt and achieve that heteropatriarchal nuclear family ideal, I think it isolates us, and I do think that we need to rethink what we can do in terms of family formation and in terms of gender roles and gender norms. I think that, I've said this before, and I'm gonna write about this in the next book. I think that we are extremely. I've been on a couple clubhouse conversations. I've been worried. I have been worried. I think more
Mm,
than anything, Black people have been extremely anxious about gender, and
mm,
sexuality, but especially gender. And the reason is because of the kinds of ideals that our ancestors were exposed to, of what ideal womanhood is and ideal manhood is, and then in some ways being demasculated and feminized in terms of Black men by the slave system, and being masculinized or defeminized in terms of Black women. I think that has left us in a very anxious state across the
Mhm.
generations, and especially today. And what I say to Black communities is that we have an opportunity to remake what gender is going to mean to us, and gender roles in marriages and families. Don't be anxious about matching and meeting what Euro-Western, Anglo-American models of gender, proper gender roles are. Why don't we decide for ourselves what works for us? And I always say, having a flexible and open understanding and orientation toward gender is most important. I love to refer to Chinua Achebe. I don't know if anyone knows the great Igbo writer Chinua Achebe from Nigeria, who passed away now. His book Things Fall Apart.
Yeah.
One of the things I
Mhm.
love about that novel is that he's making a critique of colonial intrusion in Africa as ultimate patriarchy, ultimate hypermasculinity. And if you notice his characters, he's making a critique on gender. His characters that are the most robust and the most resilient, those are characters that have traditionally masculine features and characteristics and feminine, whether they're men or women, boys or girls, they have both. They have a mixture of both. And the ones that are too effeminate or too masculine are not the strongest characters in the book. He's making a critique about gender as well, and what colonialism brought into Africa in terms of gender. And so I think we should look at our time now as an opportunity to remake ourselves and not be anxious about achieving those ideals of patriarchy. The studies show that but couples report lower levels of love and intimacy in traditional patriarchal and
Mm.
hypermasculine based marriages and families. So, I mean, who wants that, right? Who wants that? I know that some couples might be more conservative and they both want that. I'm not trying to police that either. But can we have a serious conversation about our anxiety around gender and achieving manhood and womanhood, especially because we've been locked out of it? Can
Right.
we create our own norms and have a new conversation about that with one another? Dispense with the stereotypes about Black access and hypermasculinity. Dispense with that. Dispense with trying to achieve that, and also to exert power in ways that are exploitative or harmful, and really learn to love ourselves and one another in new ways. That's where I am right now with it.
Well, that is so good. So, as I said, we're going to go a couple minutes over my last question. So, we know, we've dealt with enslavement, Jim Crow, the Reign of Terror, the things with the welfare system, of course, the prison industrial complex. We're still presently dealing with that. What, if anything, can we do to kind of buck against the system, for lack of a better way of putting that? And be more aware, be involved, maybe advocate for ourselves, not just on a personal level, but also on a societal level as well.
Community, Black wives matter, not just Black lives, Black wives. When we think about it, Marcie, love is the crux of any healthy society, right? We love children, we raise them so that they can experience and express empathy, and we do that in families. That's how we do that. And those children become healthy adults that can create, sustain, fulfill structures, leadership positions in structures to actually keep society going. The family is the crux of any society. If our families are not healthy, our societies are not healthy. So, one of the things I would want to say to my policymakers out there, activists, policy regulators, what does it mean to put Black women, Black love, Black families, Black men, Black children, our family relationships at the center of our policy decisions? Because I tell you, if we do that, we are going to address all kinds of other issues. We're going to address wealth building. We're going to address food deserts. We're going to address maternal health. We're going to be addressing education. We're going to address so many issues if we do that. One of the things I talk about, so that's one I would like to say, for those who are civil rights activists, human rights activists, but whatever it is, we have to think of forbidden Black love as America's unrecognized civil rights issue and the domino effect it has on Black communities and the wider American nation when Black love and Black families are obstructed. We have to put that in conversation with our other agenda items
Right.
in terms of activism and policy. So that's one. But two, one of the issues that we don't talk about that much, we didn't talk about that much here, but I truly address in the book is colorism and phenotypic stratification. Um, it is a major, major issue. A 2009 study showed that, especially between the ages of 20 and 29, fair-skinned Black women marry twice as much as dark-skinned Black women and 17% more than medium complexion Black women. It is a major issue. I just watched a Frontline episode yesterday on Clarence and Ginny Thomas.
Oh, God.
And it was so clear to me. Yeah, I know. It was, I would say to the audience, if you can watch that, watch that. It was so clear to me that the root of Clarence Thomas's decisions and political orientation goes right back to colorism. His own sense of self. If you listen to the way he was made fun of for being dark, for being, the odd kid out, for being, colorism marked his life in so many ways. It's unbelievable the lack of worth that people carry through life because of the impact of colorism. The other side of it is it's even unfair to fair-skinned people to give people this superficial idea that somehow they're valued because of the melanin in their skin, the lack of deeper shades of melanin in their skin. That creates superficial personalities. That is not helpful to fair-skinned people as well. That gives them a false sense of themselves as well. So we can all do something about colorism. If a 13-year-old girl that I talk about in chapter 5 can do something about it, we as adults can. We can. I think that we have to tackle that issue as individuals in our communities and in whatever structures and systems where we have power as well. That is one. Another thing is we have to tackle this issue of patriarchal marriage. We have to reinvent Black womanhood, Black manhood, Black adulthood, Black personhood. And I don't know how we exactly do that. Do we do it in our religious institutions? We bring professionals in, we talk together. I don't know, but we have to do that because we are moving further and further away from each other because we can't agree on these patriarchal ideals that still hold the consciousness of so many Black people in America, and I think that is a real hindrance as well. If Black men are expected to be providing patriarchs and they can't do that in this economy, what does that mean for the marriage? Even let's say people get how does the wife and the children look at the husband and the father in that case? What creeps into the marriage as a result of that? So those are some issues that I think we truly have to tackle, and of course we have to tackle what I call inherited poverty and wealthlessness. And I think that's the most important issue that impacts our ability to build healthy, strong families in the future, addressing that issue in particular. And that's systemic and structural.
All right, so we've got work to do, y'all. We've got work to do, but I am really glad that we had a chance to have this conversation. As you said, as I said, we did not touch on everything in the book because we don't have, 8 or 9 hours to do that.
That's
Plus
right.
the whole thing is for you to read it and to really listen or listen, because I did listen and I read some as well, but to just really absorb, you might have to stop because some parts of it are tough, just to read through and consider what our people have endured just to try to live, to try to find love, to have Black love, to establish Black families, and those sorts of things. So it is important. It's an important read or listen if you like audios, just to get that information and then, figure out what we can come together, as a collective. This is the Brown Girl Collective, Black People Collective, come together as a collective and work on, making things better for all of us. Because there's some who may choose not to be married or whatever, or may choose not to have children, but
That's
you
right.
are still a part of a community. You are still a part of a family. You are still a part, of larger society. So these things are important, irrespective of what your personal choices might be. So I thank you, Dr. Stewart. I appreciate you so much. The work that you've done, the work that you're continuing to do. I look forward to seeing what part 2 is all about, or the second book is all about, and we will go from there. So just real quickly, as means of announcement, next week, I do have a guest on that we will be talking. Her name is, let me pull it up because right now I'm so engrossed with you that I'm going to forget the lady's name. But next week, we will have Allie Collins, who will be on to talk about educational justice. So she's going to talk to us a lot about what's been happening in our school systems in terms of them trying to do away with teaching our history and things of that nature. And in 2 weeks, we're going to continue the Black love conversation with Dr. Chris Marsh, and we'll be talking about her book, The Love Jones Cohort, which is about single and living alone in the Black middle class, because we know that there are a lot of us who are in that space, and just, what that's all about. So that's part 2 of Black love is coming in a couple of weeks. So thank you so much. So yes, please go ahead and grab the book, Cheryl. So, well, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the evening. I appreciate your time and watching and just being engaged with the conversation, because it is an important conversation that we need to continue until we can, begin to see some change. So
Thank you so much for having me.
again,
I enjoyed talking
yes,
to you,
yes,
Marcie.
Dr. Stewart, don't go. I'm going to let them go, but I don't want you to go. So I can say a proper good night. But to everyone else, I look forward to seeing you again next week and the week after, as we just continue to talk about ways in which we can live well. So thanks again, and you all have a great evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on when you're watching. Take good care. Bye-bye.